It's kind of amazing, you think about modern warfare and you picture like these huge displays of technology and firepower, right? You think about cyber warfare and these incredibly sophisticated weapons systems.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in that.
But when you actually take a step back and look at history, there's this other kind of conflict that has like consistently challenged these big, powerful militaries.
You're talking about what's often called guerrilla warfare, right?
Exactly. This little war that just keeps popping up in different forms, and it's surprisingly effective. I mean, it's really fascinating how this approach that comes from like a place of less conventional power has had such a lasting impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really makes you question how we define strength in a military sense. Like if you look across, centuries of conflict, it's clear that simply having the bigger guns doesn't guarantee victory.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack this whole guerrilla warfare thing. We'll look at how it's changed over time, the principles behind it, and how it's playing out in today's world.
Right, because it's definitely not just a historical curiosity.
Exactly. And we've got some really interesting sources here, including analyses of conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Yemen.
Oh, those are some really compelling modern examples. This really highlight how relevant this is today.
Okay, so before we jump in, just a quick reminder that the term guerrilla itself actually comes from the Peninsular War, early 1800s, Spain and Portugal resisting Napoleon.
Right, but even though that's where the name comes from, the core ideas behind it, the tactics, go way further back.
Totally. So we want to kind of tackle some big questions here, like how have those core principles evolved or maybe not evolved over time? Why are we seeing so many non-state actors using these tactics?
Good question.
And then, how effective has guerrilla warfare been in recent conflicts?
Especially given how technology has changed everything.
Exactly. And with all the global shifts happening, what might the future of guerrilla warfare look like? What does this all mean for international security? I mean, it's a lot to get into. Where do you think we should start?
Well, I think it's helpful to kind of go back to the beginning, Look at how these tactics were used before they even had a name.
Okay, so like ancient history.
Yeah. I mean, understanding how these things worked way back when gives us a better sense of why they're still relevant today.
Makes sense. So what are some of the early examples that really show these guerrilla tactics in action?
Well, there's the classic example. Battle of Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE. You have these Germanic tribes led by Arminius. And they basically ambush and destroy 3 Roman legions.
Wait, they took out 3 whole legions?
Yeah, it was a total disaster for the Romans. And the key was the Germanic tribes, they knew the forest like the back of their hand, and they used that to their advantage.
So it wasn't a fair fight, in a sense.
Not at all. They used the terrain, their mobility, to overcome a much stronger but way less adaptable enemy. It's an early example of how these irregular tactics can really disrupt conventional military power.
Wow. So it's not just about beating a stronger enemy head on. It's about picking your battles, using the environment to your advantage. And it wasn't just against these big empires, right? Like you see similar tactics in uprisings too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. If you look at medieval and early modern Europe, there were tons of peasant revolts. The Jacquerie in France, the English Peasants' Revolt, all these uprisings where people were using elements of what we now call guerrilla warfare.
So coordinated attacks, using their local knowledge, things like that.
Yeah. And while they didn't always achieve their ultimate goals, they did show that even these seemingly powerless groups could challenge the established order.
It's interesting to see that kind of thread of resistance running through history, like people finding ways to fight back even when the odds seem stacked against them.
Absolutely. And as we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, we start to see a shift from these spontaneous uprisings to something more deliberate, more like a military strategy.
So more thought out, less reactive.
Yeah, more planned and coordinated. Take the Croatian light infantry during the 30 Years' War. They were masters of raiding, skirmishing, hit-and-run tactics, operating in small, mobile units. It's very recognizable as early guerrilla warfare.
And then, of course, you have the American Revolution.
Right, that's a classic example. The colonial militias, especially in the South, figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, they were incredibly effective at using these unconventional tactics against the British.
The Swamp Fox, that's such a cool nickname.
I know, right? It really captures that whole guerrilla spirit, using the environment to your advantage, being elusive, striking when the enemy least expects it.
And he was really successful, right?
Oh, yeah. Marion made life incredibly difficult for the British. He disrupted their supply lines, ambushed their troops, constantly kept them on edge.
So it wasn't about winning big battles, it was about wearing them down.
Exactly. Attrition, disruption, making it impossible for them to maintain control. And that brings us to the Peninsular War, which is like the origin story for the term guerrilla.
Right. I mean, we mentioned it earlier, but it was more than just resistance, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a full-blown, sustained, popular resistance. You had these Spanish and Portuguese fighters, the guerrilleros, working alongside regular armies like the British.
And they were really effective against Napoleon's forces.
Incredibly effective. They attacked supply lines, targeted isolated units, gathered intelligence, and basically forced the French to divert huge amounts of resources just to try to contain them.
Wow. So it showed that this little war could actually have a major impact on a big power like France.
Absolutely. And it really forced military thinkers to start taking irregular warfare seriously.
Okay, so we've got the history, the origin of the term. Now, what about those core principles that seem to be at the heart of guerrilla warfare across all these different examples?
Well, despite all the changes in warfare over the centuries, certain principles just keep showing up again and again. One of the most important is adaptability.
Adaptability, like being able to change your tactics as the situation changes.
Exactly. Guerrilla forces have to be flexible, constantly learning and evolving to exploit their enemies' weaknesses and survive.
It's kind of like, how animals adapt to survive in a changing environment.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And then there's mobility, being able to move quickly, strike, and disappear. Avoid those big head-on battles with a stronger enemy.
So like hit and run tactics.
Yeah, exactly. Mao Zedong, the Chinese revolutionary leader, he had this famous saying, "The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue."
So it's about controlling the pace of the conflict, choosing your moments.
Precisely. And then you have the unconventional tactics, which is kind of what guerrilla warfare is all about.
Like ambushes, sabotage, that sort of thing.
Yeah, all those things. And also things like using improvised explosive devices, psychological operations, anything that avoids a direct conventional fight. It's about eroding the enemy's strength and morale while preserving your own limited resources.
So maximum impact, minimal exposure.
Exactly. But all this relies on something else that's really crucial. Indigenous support.
Meaning support from the local population.
Exactly. Guerrillas need the local people for intelligence, for supplies, for recruits, for places to hide. Mao famously said that guerrillas should be like fish swimming in the sea of the people.
So without that local support, they're basically screwed.
Pretty much. They become isolated and vulnerable, which is why intelligence gathering is also so important.
Like knowing the terrain, knowing the enemy's movements.
Yeah, knowing where they are, what they're planning, where they're weak. That's a huge advantage, especially when you're outgunned and outmaneuvered. And finally, there's the psychological impact.
So it's not just about the physical damage you inflict.
No, it's also about the psychological effect. Guerrilla actions are often designed to have a disproportionate impact on the enemy's morale, to make them question their own strength, and to maybe even erode support for the war back home.
So it's about winning the narrative war as well. You mentioned Mao earlier. He and Che Guevara, they were both really influential figures when it comes to guerrilla warfare.
Absolutely. Mao, through his writings on protracted warfare, basically provided a blueprint for how a guerrilla movement could eventually win a war against a much stronger enemy. He emphasized building political support, gradually gaining control of rural areas, and eventually transitioning to conventional warfare when the time was right.
So it's a long game.
Very much so. Che Guevara, on the other hand, his FOCO theory focused more on the idea that small, highly motivated groups of revolutionaries could spark larger uprisings through their actions.
So different approaches, but both influential.
Okay, so we've got the theory down. Now let's look at some real-world examples. We talked about the American Revolution, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. How did his tactics actually help the Americans win the war? Well, Marion was operating in the South, and his constant raids and ambushes basically prevented the British from ever establishing real control over large areas. They couldn't move freely, their supply lines were disrupted, they were constantly having to watch their backs. It was a huge drain on their resources and morale.
And that tied in with the larger war effort, right?
Absolutely. By keeping the British off balance in the South, Marion freed up resources for the Continental Army to focus on other fronts. It was a classic example of how guerrilla warfare can complement conventional warfare.
A war of attrition, basically. And then there's the Spanish guerrilla war against Napoleon. You said that was a really important case. Why?
It showed that popular resistance on a massive scale could actually defeat a major power like France. I mean, the Spanish guerrillas were relentless. They fought everywhere. They never gave up.
And they really disrupted Napoleon's plans.
Hugely. He had to commit way more troops to Spain than he'd anticipated, which weakened him elsewhere. It was a major factor in his eventual downfall.
So again, it's about tying down resources, making it too costly for the enemy to stay.
Exactly. And then, jumping ahead to World War II, you see the rise of these massive partisan movements, especially in the Soviet Union.
Right, behind enemy lines, fighting the Nazis.
Yeah. The Soviet partisans were a huge force. They blew up railroads, sabotaged infrastructure, gathered intelligence, and generally made life hell for the Germans.
So they were playing a crucial role in the larger war.
Absolutely. They were disrupting German operations, freeing up Soviet troops, and they were providing valuable intelligence. It showed how effective guerrilla warfare could be when it was coordinated on a large scale.
And in France, you had the resistance, right?
Yeah, though on a smaller scale, they played a vital role. They spied on the Germans, helped Allied airmen escape, sabotaged infrastructure. Their contribution, especially to the D-Day landings, was really significant.
So even though they weren't as large as the Soviet partisans, they still had a major impact.
Definitely. And then, of course, you have the Chinese Communist Revolution, which is maybe the most successful example of guerrilla warfare in history.
Right. Mao Zedong, the long game.
Exactly. He built his movement from the ground up, starting in the countryside, gaining the support of the peasantry, and then gradually expanding his control. It was a long and brutal struggle, but it ultimately led to the communists taking over China.
So it was about winning the hearts and minds of the people as much as it was about military victories.
Absolutely. And finally, there's Vietnam, which is kind of the quintessential modern example of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, the Viet Cong, the jungle warfare, it's almost legendary.
They were incredibly effective, using the terrain to their advantage, blending in with the civilian population, and they just wore down the Americans, both militarily and psychologically.
So even though the U.S. had a much more powerful military, they couldn't defeat the Vietnamese.
It was a classic case of a guerrilla force using asymmetric tactics to overcome a stronger enemy.
Okay, so looking at all these different historical examples, what are some of the big takeaways?
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of popular support. Guerrilla movements that have succeeded have almost always had the backing of the local population.
Right, like those fish swimming in the sea.
Exactly. And they're also often characterized by protracted operations, meaning they're willing to fight for a long time, even when the odds seem stacked against them.
Patience is a virtue, I guess.
It seems so. And external support often plays a big role, too. Having allies, whether it's other countries or sympathetic groups, can make a huge difference.
Okay, so those are some of the historical lessons. Now, how does all of this relate to modern warfare and this idea of asymmetric warfare that we hear so much about?
Well, asymmetric warfare basically describes any conflict where the two sides have very different strengths and weaknesses.
So like a David and Goliath situation.
Exactly. And guerrilla warfare is definitely a key tactic in asymmetric warfare, but it's not the only one. You also have things like terrorism, cyber attacks, economic warfare, information warfare.
So it's about finding your opponent's weak points and exploiting them rather than trying to match their strength head on.
Right. And the goals of asymmetric warfare can be quite varied. Sometimes it's about inflicting so much pain on the enemy that they're forced to withdraw, like we saw in Vietnam. Other times it's about achieving a specific political objective, even if you can't defeat the enemy militarily.
So it's about using whatever tools you have to achieve your goals, even if those tools are unconventional.
Exactly. And this has become increasingly important in the post-Cold War world, where the U.S. has had such overwhelming military dominance.
So potential adversaries had to find other ways to compete.
Exactly. They couldn't hope to match the U.S. in a conventional fight, so they turned to asymmetric tactics. And the spread of technology, globalization, all of that has made it easier for them to do so.
Right, because now even non-state actors can get their hands on some pretty sophisticated weaponry and technology.
Absolutely. And that leads to another really important trend in modern warfare, which is the rise of non-state actors.
You mean groups like terrorist organizations and insurgents?
Exactly. Historically, a lot of guerrilla warfare was about groups trying to create their own state, like the communists in China or the Viet Cong. But today, we're seeing a lot of non-state actors who have different goals.
Like what?
Well, some are terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS who use violence to achieve their political aims. Others are insurgents or rebel groups who might be fighting for greater autonomy or control over resources.
Yeah.
You also have militias and paramilitary groups, often operating in these kind of gray areas, sometimes aligned with government, sometimes not.
So it's a much more complex landscape than it used to be?
Definitely. And even criminal organizations are getting in on the act, using guerrilla-style tactics to protect their turf.
So the lines between different types of actors are getting blurred. And what's driving this trend, this rise of non-state actors?
Well, one factor is the easy availability of weapons. Small arms are everywhere these days. And then you have the growth of illicit economies, things like drug trafficking, that provide funding for these groups.
So money talks.
Always. And then there's the weakening of state authority in some parts of the world, which creates opportunities for these groups to operate. And of course, you have the internet and social media, which have completely transformed how these groups communicate, recruit, and spread their message.
Right, they're using technology in very sophisticated ways.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another really important aspect of modern guerrilla warfare: the impact of technology.
So how has technology changed the game?
In a lot of ways. For one thing, it's made it easier for non-state actors to access capabilities that were once only available to states. Things like drones, cyber tools, even some pretty advanced weapons.
So it's leveled the playing field in a sense?
In some ways, yes, but it's also created new vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how reliant modern societies are on technology.
Yeah, everything's connected.
And that makes them vulnerable to disruption, whether it's through cyber attacks or physical attacks on critical infrastructure.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly. So let's look at some specific examples of how technology is impacting modern guerrilla warfare. One area where it's had a huge impact is communications.
Like encrypted messaging apps and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. These tools allow guerrilla groups to communicate securely, coordinate operations, and disseminate propaganda, all while being incredibly difficult to track.
So they're harder to disrupt.
Much harder. And then there's the whole realm of information operations, which is basically about shaping the narrative, controlling the information space.
Like propaganda and stuff.
Yeah, but it has become much more sophisticated than that. We're talking about targeted campaigns across multiple platforms using social media, videos, all sorts of things to influence public opinion.
So it's about winning the hearts and minds, but in a very 21st century way.
Exactly. And then there are drones, which have been a game changer in a lot of conflicts.
Right, because they're relatively cheap and easy to get hold of.
Exactly. And they can be used for all sorts of things, from reconnaissance to delivering explosives. We've seen groups like ISIS and the Houthis in Yemen using drones very effectively.
So it's like giving these groups their own air force, in a sense.
In some ways, yes. And then you have cyber operations, which are becoming increasingly important.
So things like hacking and disrupting computer systems.
Yeah. Guerrilla groups are starting to use cyber attacks to target their enemy's infrastructure, steal information, and disrupt their operations. It's a very effective way to cause chaos and disruption without having to engage in direct combat.
A virtual battlefield.
Exactly. And then there are the weapons themselves. The proliferation of advanced weapons, things like anti-tank missiles and improvised explosive devices, has given guerrilla groups much more firepower than they used to have.
So they can inflict more damage, even against a technologically superior enemy.
Absolutely. And they're also using things like digital currencies to move money around without being detected.
So it's a whole new ballgame, really.
Totally. Technology has revolutionized guerrilla warfare, giving these groups new capabilities and making them much more difficult to counter.
Okay, so let's look at some real-world examples of how all of this is playing out. Let's start with Syria. You said that was a particularly complex conflict.
Oh, it's incredibly complex. You have so many different actors involved, all with their own agendas. You have the Syrian government, various rebel groups, ISIS, Kurdish forces, and then all the external powers who are backing different sides. It's a total mess.
And everyone's using these asymmetric tactics.
Absolutely. We've seen everything from sophisticated urban warfare to the use of tunnels and improvised weapons. And the information war has been incredibly intense, with all sides using social media to spread their message and demonize their enemies.
And then you have ISIS, which kind of emerged out of this chaos.
Right. They were very effective at using a combination of guerrilla tactics and conventional warfare to seize and hold territory. And they were masters of propaganda, using social media to recruit fighters and spread their ideology.
So they were really a product of this new, more complex kind of warfare.
Definitely. And then you have the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, who have been very successful at using guerrilla tactics to fight both ISIS and Turkey. They've been very adaptable, very good at using the terrain to their advantage.
And they've received a lot of support from the U.S., right?
Yeah, which has been crucial to their success. It shows how important external support can be for guerrilla groups. And then you have the role of proxy forces, which are basically groups that are backed by other countries.
So like fighting someone else's war?
In a sense, yes. And this has been a big factor in the Syrian conflict, with countries like Russia, Iran, and Turkey all supporting different groups.
So it's not just a civil war, it's a regional proxy war as well.
Exactly. And all of this is playing out in a very technologically advanced environment. I mean, you see groups using everything from drones to encrypted communications to sophisticated weapons.
So it's a really good example of how all of these different trends in modern warfare are converging in one place.
Definitely. Syria is kind of a microcosm of the future of warfare, in a sense.
Okay, let's move on to Ukraine. How has guerrilla warfare played out there since the Russian invasion?
Well, what's interesting about Ukraine is that they were actually preparing for this kind of conflict for years, ever since Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. They knew that if Russia ever launched a full-scale invasion, they would need to be able to resist asymmetrically.
So they were ready for this kind of fight?
Yeah, to a certain extent. They'd been training civilians in guerrilla tactics, setting up underground networks, stockpiling weapons. And when the invasion happened, they were able to activate these networks very quickly.
And they've been pretty effective, right?
Very effective. They've been harassing Russian forces, disrupting their supply lines, ambushing convoys, and they've been very good at using social media to document Russian atrocities and mobilize international support.
So they're fighting the information war as well.
Absolutely. And they've been very innovative in their use of technology. They've been using drones for reconnaissance and even attacks. They've been using social media to crowdfund their operations. And they've been very good at adapting to the changing situation on the ground.
And they've been getting a lot of help from the West, right?
Yeah, in terms of weapons, intelligence, and training. But the Ukrainians are still very much in control of their own resistance.
So it's a good example of how a well-prepared and well-supported guerrilla force can really make life difficult for a much larger and more powerful enemy.
Definitely. And it shows how important it is for countries like Ukraine to be prepared for this kind of conflict, because it's becoming more and more common.
Okay, our last case study is Yemen, the Houthis fighting against the Saudi-led coalition. What can we learn from that conflict?
Well, Yemen is a really interesting case because it shows how a relatively small and poorly equipped group can still hold out against a much stronger enemy, even in the face of overwhelming firepower.
And they've been doing this for years now, right?
Yeah, the conflict's been going on since 2014. And the Houthis have been remarkably resilient. They've been using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. They've been developing their own weapon systems, including ballistic missiles and drones, and they've been very good at mobilizing popular support.
So they've been able to punch above their weight, so to speak.
Definitely. And they've also been very adaptable, changing their tactics as the situation demands.
And they've been getting support from Iran, right?
It's been widely reported, though Iran denies it. But regardless of where they're getting their support, the Houthis have shown that it's possible to sustain a guerrilla war against a much stronger adversary for a long time, even in the face of a massive air campaign.
Okay, so looking across these three conflicts, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, what are some of the big trends that we're seeing in modern guerrilla warfare?
Well, one thing that's clear is that technology is becoming increasingly important. Guerrilla groups are using everything from drones to cyber attacks to sophisticated weapon systems.
And they're getting better at it all the time.
Absolutely. And they're also becoming more adept at using information operations to shake the narrative and win support.
So the information war is just as important as the physical war.
More than ever. And then there's the whole issue of climate change and resource scarcity, which are likely to create new opportunities for guerrilla groups to exploit.
So the future of warfare is going to be even more complex and challenging.
Definitely. And this raises some really important questions for policymakers.
Like what?
Well, how do you counter a threat that's so diffuse, so adaptable, so good at using technology? How do you win a war when the enemy doesn't even wear a uniform and can blend in with the civilian population? These are questions that we're still grappling with.
And there are no easy answers.
No, there aren't. But it's clear that traditional approaches to warfare are no longer enough. We need to be thinking more creatively, more innovatively, if we want to counter this evolving threat.
So it's a whole new world of warfare.
It is. and it's one that we need to understand if we want to be prepared for the challenges ahead.
Well, that's a lot to think about. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into guerrilla warfare. It's been really eye-opening.
You're welcome. I'm glad we could explore this together.
And for all of you listening, we hope this has given you a better understanding of this complex and ever-evolving form of conflict. Because, as we've seen, guerrilla warfare is not just a relic of the past. It's a very real and present danger that we need to take seriously. And it's a danger that's only going to become more acute in the years to come, as technology continues to advance and the world becomes increasingly unstable. So, we need to be asking ourselves some hard questions about how we're going to deal with this threat. How are we going to defend ourselves against an enemy that can strike from anywhere at any time? How are we going to win a war that may not even look like a war? These are questions that we all need to be thinking about because the future of our security may depend on it.